Hey everybody, welcome back to episode 2 of Classic Cinema Spotlight, the show where I pick the guest and they pick the movie. On today's episode, I am joined by Emmy-nominated and producer slash film critic over at Screen Junkies and Screen Junkies News, a former movie trivia Schmodown champion, Mr. Dan Murrell. Thanks for joining me, man.
It's my pleasure. I love talking movies and I love talking classics.
Yeah, I've recently been trying to include classics into the conversation as much as I can on my channel because, you know, you can't let the classics die. I don't care what people say. Just because it's in black and white, it's not boring.
Well, that's the thing is so many people hear that it's a classic or they see that it's in black and white or that it was made, you know, more than 20 or 30 years ago and they think like, oh, it's out of date, it's boring. It's like, no, these movies are as vibrant and alive and current as any of the other ones. There are some movies that are considered classics that I think are a little dated. Easy Rider is one for me that I think is very much of its time and is a great time capsule of the time that it was made. But maybe today it feels a little dated. The movie we're going to talk about today, and movies like Double Indemnity and The Apartment, so much of Billy Wilder's work and other movies, you know, yes, they were made 10, 20, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago, but they are so still relevant and current. Movies like Network, more relevant and current than they were when they were made. Even, it's so important, I think, to get to know these movies because they still have so much to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd hate for somebody to think poorly like of a movie of, I don't know, maybe Citizen Kane, just because it's a little old. Not throwing any shade at anybody, but a movie that I had watched recently that struck me how relevant it was Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator. Especially that closing speech. I've never seen that film before, and it just completely floored me. But today we're talking about the 1962 David Lean film, Lawrence of Arabia. What is it about this film that has such a connection to yourself? Like, what was the driving force of wanting to talk about this film today?
Well, until recently, you know, unless you're the most like avid of film goers, you know, someone like a Roger Ebert, who was kind of my role model, and you know, I loved his style. You know, he had seen everything. But, you know, I, as a film goer, I have gaps in my filmography that I'm trying to fill in. And one of them was I had seen Lawrence of Arabia when I was younger. I didn't remember much about it. And I kind of felt like I probably saw it at an age where I would appreciate it a little bit more. And I had just never looped back. And there was an opportunity for me to see it here in Los Angeles a few weeks ago, projected in 70 millimeter. And I could not pass that chance up. So it's fresh on my mind. It is, you know, even though I had seen it when I was younger, I feel like this was almost kind of my first viewing. And to see it in that way, and again, to feel how alive that movie still is, it just seemed like a natural thing. You know, it's really, I could talk about any number of them, but Lawrence of Arabia is so fresh in my mind. I thought it would be really fun to kind of break down and discuss, because I do think that's one of those movies that people avoid because it's old, because it's long, because people think that it's outdated. And there are a couple of things that probably haven't held up, which we'll talk about, but I think that it is just pure cinema. And I love that because not many movies are made like that anymore.
Mm-hmm. I would say that no movies are made like this anymore. I'm constantly astounded at how much thought and care is put in to films that come around this era, in the classic era. And it's been such a pleasure this past year. I've been trying to watch as many classics films as I can. I think I'm up into the 50s this year. And nice. With films like this or Seven Samurai, even though that they have the runtime of nearly 4 hours, I was still constantly blown away just reading about the care that David Lean had put into these scenes. Some scenes specifically like the Mirage scene, just sprinkling little black pebbles on the sand to kind of draw our eye, or painting a white streak up the middle of the screen to simulate the camel's tracks. Just small things like that, or them going back and brushing off the camel's track so they can get another take. It's just much like Steven Spielberg had said in some of his quotes about this film, is just watching this movie. it's hard not to think of the behind the scenes detail and the care that went into this film, and it's just not something that you really see that often today.
Well, no, because we have now in CG and and I don't just mean effects. I mean, directors have so many tools to enhance. Mad Max Fury Road, for example, is a great example of a lot of practical stuff, going out on location, shooting real things, but it is also enhanced by computer effects. They're invisible a lot of the time, but it still exists, and there's nothing wrong with that. But what I love about this movie is it was made in a time where you don't have those tools and resources. And you're right. There's so many times that I would watch, and he would have those huge vista shots of the encampments and stuff, of these hundreds and thousands of people riding and charging into battle. And you realize that you had to just do that. You had to just get thousands of people. You had to set up this massive encampment, and it does lend, I think, so much more appreciation. I think maybe even more so than when it came out, to see what resources directors have today, and then the fact that you're able to do something on the scale of this movie 50 plus years ago that is just as impressive as something made today with the tools that directors have at hand. And I think there's so much to be said for that. And again, like the classics age, they get better, and you appreciate things more. And that's what I found watching this. Was I appreciate so much of the craft behind this more, knowing that David Lean did not have the tools at his disposal that directors have today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just some of these scenes in particular, I already kind of hinted at it, but that Mirage sequence, just watching that film, it's hard not to wonder how that scene was made. It kind of pushes me to dig a bit deeper into the film, and not just about certain themes of the film or read of what other people are saying about T.E. Lawrence as a historical figure, but a lot of the behind the scenes of this movie, and the way it's 70 millimeter, the panoramic vision. It's really able to engross you as an audience member into the desert. And I think that it's because of that, as well as the screenplay, that makes this movie stand the test of time, to where we're talking about it even today. And I think T.E. Lawrence, among all of the films that I've seen that are of the classic era, I think T.E. Lawrence is one of, if not the most fascinating characters that I have had the pleasure of watching. I think entire theses and entire TED Talks could be had to discuss this man, whether it be historically or kind of this glorified, fictionalized look at his life. I saw one comment that said that this movie is kind of how he would view himself, and it's almost this. It's this very fictionalized version of this character. What do you think about T.E. Lawrence makes him such a memorable character 50 to 70 years later?
Well, here's what really struck me watching it. And again, kind of rewatching it in the perspective of movies of its time. I think that so many other movies and so many other directors would have kind of reimagined him as like, let's get Charlton Heston or let's get John Wayne, and let's turn this guy into like this macho, tough guy who just goes in there and takes care of business. And I love that the David Lean and the writers of this film said, no, like, this is not the kind of character that you would see kind of holding down a lot of epics of that time. He is complicated. He's complex. He does things that are very morally ambiguous, which, again, in the late 50s, early 60s, you didn't see a whole lot of that in a mainstream film. The idea of a character kind of being, almost murderous at times. Certainly duplicitous. Certainly somebody who kind of loses himself. And Peter O'Toole's performance is so amazing. Just the way that you see him descend, the way that he's not perfect. He doesn't emerge from the desert this conquering hero. He's shaken. He's lost himself. He doesn't know who he is, and also generally, and I know this seems a little weird, but like the fact that Peter O'Toole was given the license to play him in times almost very effeminate, which again, the complete opposite of at that time in Hollywood, what the anchor character of an epic would be is he's kind of this sort of wispy guy. And, as you read into the character, the actual person of Lawrence, there are, of course, there's always theories and suggestions and questions, but the fact that they allowed him to not be this just total Hollywood chunk of granite, which is what you see so often, and that he's allowed to be this real person with idiosyncrasies and quirks and kind of hidden aspects to his character. There's subtext to it. And the way that Peter O'Toole is able to kind of take us on that journey through his eyes, again, is what I think separates this movie from others. How many other historical epics of the time that were 2.5, 3 hours long just haven't aged like Lawrence of Arabia? And I think it's because it is so strongly painted and portrayed, directed, performed. Everything about this movie is done so extremely well that it just is in a class by itself.
Mm-hmm. I think, as you said, the character of T.E. Lawrence, this film actually holds the record. I'm fairly certain this holds the record for the longest movie to not have any dialogue from a woman. And I think that, with that being said, T.E. Lawrence would probably be the closest character that we have in this film to having a female perspective. He's not trying to engage in these... He's trying to settle a lot of the conflicts in this movie, where he kills that I don't remember the character's name, but he kills that man for trying to steal something from the other tribe. He kills them to kind of settle the score between the two of them, because he's trying to bring these two groups together. And I think that quality of his character is very unlike that of, as you said, a lot of these very macho characters that you would see, especially of that time. And I loved his character arc in the way that it was so clearly defined, and how he begins the film with this very sure of himself attitude, very confident. He volunteers to go out to the desert, and he says about the match, he says, well, the key is not minding that it hurts. He thinks that he will enjoy the desert. And then he has the line later in the film, he says, I pray that I may never see the desert again, because he realizes how harsh and how unflinchingly aggressive the desert can be. And I think that all of those aspects really infuse into this character to have his character arc be so clearly defined and so memorable. And I would love that you were able to go on this journey with him, this 4-hour-long journey. And honestly, for myself, I don't know about you, when I was watching this, I didn't really feel the runtime was weighing this film down, because I think just seeing him and how he interacts with the desert for this period of time that he's out there, I think that the runtime is very crucial to the storytelling of this character. Would you agree?
I agree. And I think even, and this is, I was going back after I saw it and rereading some reviews, and I was reading Roger Ebert's review. He did an essay, he's reviewed it a few times, but he did an essay on it for his series called The Great Movies. And he said that seeing Lawrence of Arabia on the big screen is something that every film lover should do before they die. And I agree, because when you see it, not that it can't be appreciated, you can always appreciate it, but when you see it on a big screen, the desert becomes a character, essentially. The desert becomes part of the movie itself. It becomes, when you see it 50 feet tall projected in front of you, it's almost like you're there, and the vastness of it, the unforgiving nature, the fact that you can look for miles and see nothing, and you see them when they're trekking, when they're making that long trek, and there's just this vastness ahead of them and behind them. When he goes to save, that man, is just like nothing is written which the tragedy being that he later has to kill him to keep the peace. But when he goes to save him, and you understand the enormity of this task, I think that the ability of the film to use its setting almost as a character and to use the art of cinema, and that includes, I think, David Lean knowing how it would be projected and what it would look like on such a big screen. It is one of the best examples I've ever seen of just the use of the format, just the filmic format to tell a story. Mm-hmm. And, that's why I always say, movies can always be appreciated in just about any format. But I do think that there are some that you really don't get the scope of until you see it projected, because that's how they were meant to be made, particularly a lot of these, from this era. They were meant to be seen. They were made to be seen larger than life, and they're made that way. And Christopher Nolan currently makes his movies that way. He's very like, I make these movies to be seen in a theater. And I think that this is the one that I would point to when you say, like, well, does it really matter whether you see a movie at home or in a theater? This one, yes, it does, because I think you appreciate it so much. And I think that the desert itself becomes a character even more so when you kind of experience it for yourself.
I think I totally agree that film is similar in the way to something like music. Like if you're listening to an album or watching a film, the way that you experience that art is very determined of how in which you are experiencing it. If you're listening to an album, on the speakers of your phone, it's not going to be the same as seeing it live or seeing it with really nice headphones. And I would say that it's the same with watching a movie. If you're watching Lawrence of Arabia or Dunkirk, Christopher Nolan was pretty adamant about not watching this movie at home or at an iPad or an iPhone. I don't think that it's doing this movie any sort of justices, watching it in this way. And even though I watch this movie at home on my television, I would absolutely leap at the opportunity to be able to go and see this movie on the big screen. Are there any other films from this era that stand out to you that you think they should be seen in a similar way?
Well, there's currently this summer in a lot of areas they re-released 2001 on 70mm as well, which I saw, and I certainly, again, just scope and size and enormity. You can see more of what Kubrick had in mind, I think, with his vision of that. And, Lawrence of Arabia and 2001 are both movies that I think some people would say are slow, quote unquote. I agree that they are deliberate, but again, when you see the vastness of them, and you see that projected, it's almost like those shots are held so long because it's a spectacle, and they're giving the audience time to really soak that in. And I think that's really underscored when you see something like this on the big screen. And I do think that there's movies like Charlton Heston's Ben-Hur, like so many of them that are labeled epics that are very long, that people consider to be, it's so slow, it's so long. The Ten Commandments is another one. I think that there's a reason that David Lean made movies like this, and it's because they were made for the medium. They were made for the format. They were made for you to. It's like going to a play. They have intermissions. They have overtures. They're made to be a spectacle, and when you lose some of that when you see them on a smaller screen, I can see how at home Lawrence of Arabia perhaps might be more of a trying experience, or it might test your patience, or you're looking at a shot and saying like, and while they're holding the shot for a really long time. And I think that's some of what you're losing in the translation of watching it at home and being kind of transfixed by the enormity of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I again, I think you had kind of mentioned that it is sort of a breath of fresh air to be able to watch this movie and really appreciate the amount of care that is put into each of these scenes. I think you could dissect a number of scenes in this movie and talk about the sort of care that David Lean had put into these moments, and this film has left a sort of legacy because of that to inspire filmmakers like Martin Scorsese or Steven Spielberg or even Brian De Palma. I mean, they were all kind of childhood friends, so it makes sense that they would all be inspired at the same times. Yeah. But it's movies like these that sort of pave the way for other filmmakers to be inspired by. And I will say, I do have a few issues with the film that I think that have not held up as well. Probably the most glaring would be Alec Guinness's performance in this film. He's a great actor. This is actually the first movie that I have seen him in that is not Star Wars. But watching this film, it is very troubling to see him, his character in this film, and I know it is a product of its time, but I don't think that that's really an excuse. How did you feel about watching this, especially in a day and age where that's such a controversial topic?
Sure. Well, number one, you have to watch The Bridge on the River Kwai. That's your next assignment.
Yes.
Also, David Lean.
Yes.
It's incredible. And Alec Guinness it's probably the best performance of his career. Number two, when I said that there are some things that don't hold up, that and Anthony Quinn were the two that held the most in my mind in particular. And number one, yes, obviously that would not fly today. I think that Alec Guinness's performance is really good in this movie, but it is a relic of a time when the conventional wisdom was that if you have somebody who's playing someone that's not white, you just get somebody who's white and put brown makeup on him. Charlton Heston plays a Mexican in Touch of Evil. The list is
John Wayne plays Genghis Khan.
John Wayne plays Genghis Khan, and it was this idea of like, well, we have to have a star attached to the movie, so it doesn't, getting a name is more important than getting the ethnicity of the character right. So while I love Guinness's performance in this movie, I do think doing I think what would be considered now, brown face, is one of the things about this film that has not really stood the test of time. And that happens. You see that, sometimes movies are able to sort of weather that. I think this movie's one of them where people kind of say like, well, that's an anachronism. That's definitely something out of date, but it's something that we can kind of put aside, and look at other elements of. And then I think that there's some movies that over time, their content has just not been able to allow it to stand as part of the canon. 30 or 40 years ago, D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation was considered one of the seminal films in the American filmography. And I think that in the last decades, people have been able to look at the content of that movie and say, that it's not enough, the scale of it or the popularity of it or the scope of it. What the content is just too repellent, I think, to modern sensibilities to allow it to stand the test of time. I feel like The Jazz Singer with Al Jolson, again with the blackface segments, is something that, yes, it is the first sound movie, and it will, not the first big mainstream talkie, full talkie, and it will stand the test of time. For that. At the same time, I don't think that it is revered in the same way that it was even 20 years ago. So I do think that's part of assessing the canon as society progresses. Are these things kind of counter to the progress that we've made just societally, or is it an aspect that we can certainly should be noted, but that it should be weighed against the rest? And that's where I kind of felt like with Alec Guinness is I don't feel like the character itself is offensively portrayed. I don't feel like that character is made to be a stereotype. I think the character's actually written pretty well. It's the choice of actor, obviously, and makeup and all that stuff that I think makes it a little bit dated, a lot dated. Mm-hmm. But I think when you weigh it against everything, I don't know if it affects the legacy of the film overall.
Mm-hmm. Something that I came across when I was kind of researching about this film, and it's something that I kind of have to push back a little bit as being one of the criticisms of this movie. Something that I saw a lot is that this film is a proponent of the quote-unquote white savior mentality, that you need to have somebody come in who is white and kind of correct the situation. I'm curious to get your feedback on that, because I have a stance of my own. When you hear that criticism about this film, what comes across your mind?
I mean, there's certainly, I think the conditions exist for people to say like, oh, white savior guy coming in, but I think that's kind of, I would push back against that criticism too, because I think if that's your takeaway from the movie, then you sort of missed a large part of what the movie was actually all about and what the journey of that character was, which is that it's about this guy who comes in, who's an outsider, who becomes so taken by becoming this revered person inside those circles that he thinks he knows what's best for them. And he actually leads them into a very damaging and ruinous and situation that ends up not having their best interests at heart. So I think that's actually part of his character flaw, is he does regard himself as somebody who knows what's best for them and is going to lead them to what he has decided is their ideal, when that does not turn out necessarily to be in their best interest. So I would push back against that criticism. I see the root of it, but I just don't think that the content of the film bears that out. Mm-hmm.
I completely agree. I was saying the same thing when I was reading those. Like, he's wearing these literally white robes, taking on this culture and perhaps appropriating it in some sort of way. But he comes into the situation so arrogant and so in such a way that he believes that he is in the right and that he's going to be able to kind of fix this situation very easily. Shocker. Mm-hmm. Finding peace in this time period and in the Middle East, it's not the easiest thing to do. And I think that, again, if you leave this film and you think that he corrected what was wrong or that he was in the right, you kind of like, okay, well, what part of that 4-hour-long movie did you not see? Because there's many parts in this, and many moments in this film where he feels like he didn't really accomplish what he set out to do. I think there's many moments in this film that prove that point very well. And even towards the end of this film, his legacy, well, it's technically the beginning of the film, his legacy is questioned when they're at that memorial service and everybody's saying, well, he's an exhibitionist. He was a great warrior. They're saying all these things, good and bad, about him, none of which are actually false. They're all, pretty spot on, but it's not like this person is looked at with the highest regard. When David Lean was becoming kind of infatuated with this character, he, from his childhood, had kind of seen him as a very heroic person. But once he kind of delved deeper into what actually happened with T.E. Lawrence is when he started to really uncover the truths behind this character. So that is one of those pushbacks that I would say is probably not the most sound. Are there any other issues with this film that stood out to you besides the race relations being a little bit dated?
Yeah. Not really. I mean, honestly, like I said, I saw this with a crowd, and it got laughs still. It got gasps still. I mean, there was silence when there needed to be silence. There was applause when there needed to be applause. You know, it seemed to work pretty well. You know, I think that. The main issue that it has is, you know, I would acknowledge criticisms that it does paint Arabs at times with a very broad brush. A lot of that is cultural ignorance. A lot of that is just Hollywood being Hollywood, where everything is heightened to the nth degree. But again, I never, from my perspective, and there may be others from different perspectives that have different views on it, that saw things that I didn't, that may regard this differently. But, you know, from my perspective, I never saw anyone being portrayed offensively. And I think that's where the line is between this is a little dated and I you know, obviously different decisions would have been made today, or, you know, this is a patently offensive film. I thought by and large, particularly from the filmmaking technique and the script, the performances, it all pretty much held up for me. Even performance-wise, sometimes these older films, they're rooted in stage play. They're rooted in vaudeville. They're rooted in a very broad technique. And I found these performances to not have that sort of hammy classic Hollywood quality that a lot of them could have. A lot of them are very subtle performances. Obviously, Peter O'Toole being first and foremost. So, you know, this is not, I really didn't feel a lot of things from this film feeling dated. So much of it seemed contemporary and current that it really kind of surprised me, really. Even more than I had anticipated. It really surprised me, and it shows why this film continues to be so revered. It's because it does hold up in so many aspects.
Mm-hmm. Well, I hope that in us talking about this, we're continuing pushing the importance of this film and pushing the legacy that this movie has led. Thank you so much for joining me today, Dan, and talking about probably one of the most influential films of all time.
I think so. It's definitely one of the most influential. You know, the brilliant editor Ann Coates just passed away a matter of weeks ago, and even on that, there's something there for everybody. I think even editors, as an editing technique, it's such a brilliant example of knowing when not to cut and realizing that that's part of editing too. I just think it has so much to offer, and if you haven't seen it, if you're listening to this and you haven't seen it, I would urge you please to give it a try. It really is, I think, one of the landmark films of the medium, of the form, not just American cinema, but cinema. And, you know, I can't recommend it enough. It really is. And if you can see it project, if it's playing anywhere near you, by God, by all means, definitely go see it, because that is a real experience and just intoxicating. If you're a cinema lover, it is an absolutely intoxicating movie-going experience.
Well, once again, Dan, thank you so much for joining me. Is there anywhere that the people can find you, where they have to look?
You can find me on Twitter @MurrellDan. You can also find me pretty much every day on Screen Junkies News. We have a morning show every day, Screen Junkies Universe, as well as reviews every week. Myself and Roth Cornett reviewing the new releases. Also, you can find honest trailers on Screen Junkies. I help write that, and just in general, anything Screen Junkies related, I probably saw it or at least waved as it passed by. So we have a lot of fun over there. We love talking movies, and we're also trying to sort of encourage, as well as the Star Warses and Marvels and DCs of the world, we do want to also encourage people to just fall in love with film. You know, if you're a movie lover, there's so much out there, and I love talking about this just as much as I love talking about, well, certainly more than I love talking about some of the big movies, but just as much even the big movies that I love. You know, this is so much fun. So thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Well, I hope that you'll come back on, but thank you guys for listening today. I hoped you liked today's episode, and if you did, you can click on the link down below, and you can subscribe to my channel to see more movie reviews and movie related things. And guys, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.